You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome back to Autumn on the Air and the second part of our series on the history of tech transfer. In part one, we explored the origins of university tech transfer offices and learned about the fascinating story of Dr. Harry Steenbock and the discovery of vitamin D. Today, I'm excited to dive deeper into this topic with our guest, Kevin Walters. I'm curious, Kevin, why do you think WARF was a success when similar efforts at, Toronto, you mentioned, Columbia, Minnesota, and California weren't successful?
I think that it goes back to that agricultural connection, that they're just thinking about this in a different way. They understand we don't tend to think necessarily of agriculture as being commercial, but certainly there's an economic relationship there. If you're all the way back to 1890, you're thinking about these commercial questions about how do you create better processes to sell milk on the market? How do you create cheese? How do you use science for that? They're thinking about this in a way that's commercial. And it really does just get them thinking in a different process. I think it's also Wisconsin has this alumni network and this alumni connection. Wisconsin is one of the founding members of the American Association of Universities, along with places like Johns Hopkins and UC Berkeley. And so it's a very prominent widespread university that does everything. It's a comprehensive university that has agricultural schools, it has letters and science schools, it has business graduates. And so all of these things come together in a way that I think really makes it more successful. I will also say some of it, as we know, also in tech transfer, some of it is luck or serendipity or happenstance. That it just so happened that this was happening at the right time when vitamins were getting big. There's one of my advisors wrote a book called Vitamania, which is all about this craze that sweeps the nation. Once you figure out what vitamins are and you figure out that it's a pretty big deal to have food that can prevent your child from getting rickets or can prevent them from getting scurvy. And this process of vitamin fortification really takes off in the 1920s. And so some of it is timing. Timing and the right structure, and then just the right science at the right time.
So then what happens after that? Do other universities follow on pretty quickly after WARF and establish tech transfer offices, or did it take a while for this idea to kind of catch on?
By the end of the 30s, there are other universities that are seeing the success that WARF is having. So one thing I should say before I get to that is just that so it turns out Quaker Oats is WARF's first licensee, but it turns out relatively quickly that the oatmeal is actually not the best use of this vitamin D process. So the WARF then goes out and finds these other licensees, and they end up licensing. It takes about 10 years, but they are able to develop what we now know as vitamin D milk and a process called biosterol, which is a vitamin D supplement. But in the interim, WARF is also struggling with recognizing that, this might not work out. We have a little bit of money from Quaker, but we're not sure if this is going to persist. And then the depression happens. And so WARF develops a system where they start investing the proceeds that they do have into an investment portfolio. And that's really where the financial success comes. So the Steenbock patents over the course of their patent life, which is 17 years at the time, earns about $14 million, which is about $200 million adjusted for inflation, about $200 million. But it's really investing that money into a portfolio that attracts people's attention because they realize that WARF is able to give money back to the university. And so other universities, I think Iowa State is the second one to do it. Purdue tries it as well. But there's this mini boom of universities that are trying this research foundation idea, that are trying patenting. There's a book by Greg Mowry who talks about this, that it's not a coincidence, I think, that you also have Big Ten universities, you also have public universities that are trying this. So between the 20s and the 30s, there's this mini boom of other universities trying the WARF model or trying it different ways. But that really doesn't last over the long term.
So ultimately, what happened to the Steenbock patents? Were they litigated or, not, or were they just licensed to a bunch of different corporations and other entities?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, they were licensed to non-exclusively to dairies, exclusively to Quaker for breakfast cereals, and then to 5 different pharmaceutical companies are creating supplemented vitamin D, basically an oil that is a vitamin supplement. And that's successful over the course of a long time. I think one of the things that WARF is doing, consistent with Steenbock's need for control, they're also very careful to test their products. So their licensees, they have control laboratories that are making sure that anybody that licenses their the process to is using it, and the product that ends up on the market does actually have vitamin D in it. And this is consistent with Steenbock's ethos, because he wants to make sure that the science is true and right and accurate. But it's also partly a reaction to the American Medical Association, which doesn't know yet whether vitamin D can be toxic. So on the one hand, you have people who are concerned that there's not enough vitamin D in these products. And then you have the American Medical Association, which is concerned there might be too much. So WARF is kind of walking this line. And in the process of that, they do become litigious. They do go out making sure that, one way to protect and make sure that your licensees are producing good vitamin D is a control laboratory. But you also need to make sure that there aren't infringers out there who are making false products. And one of the stories that Harry Russell told was being on Michigan Avenue in Chicago and seeing a storefront display, which had an incandescent light bulb and some oil running underneath it, and was claiming that this oil was vitamin D fortified, and that's just not how it works. You need a specialized UV light lamp to get this process going. And that was the example he used of why WARF was suing some infringers and basically saying, we don't want fraud products getting out there. And there were requests coming into WARF about like vitamin D fortified tobacco and chewing gum and pillowcases. And there's a list of all of these requests that they got, in which WARF was basically saying, we're not going to do that. There's also a very famous canister of vitamin D beer, slightly made of vitamin D beer, which I think WARF was not involved in that. But so there's this question of control that comes from Steenbock's particular ethos of being a scientist governs WARF for a while. And then what happens, though, is that in the early 30s, the New Deal comes along. And so the other reason why WARF is doing this control is that there's not a government agency to do this. Like now, we would certainly say we would never have a nonprofit foundation exercising this amount of quality control over a vitamin D industry. It's just not the way we would do it. But WARF was really filling a gap. And I think that's the part that sometimes people miss about this story is that it did take 10 years to develop vitamin D milk. This was a process. And this is something that we talk about in tech transfer. People think that you just license this and the money comes rolling in. It's a very hard and difficult process to do it. And this was no different. Even though this was a home run invention, it took a long time for them to sort out this process. But then the political winds change, FDR is elected, and the New Deal comes in, and they decide, rightfully so, I would say, that this is probably a place where the government should be stepping in. And they go to WARF, and so there's a assistant attorney general in charge of the antitrust division named Thurman Arnold, who is a pretty famous lawyer. And he comes to WARF and he writes a letter, and he basically calls the president of WARF to Washington and basically says, we've looked at your contracts and there's a few things you're doing that are actually antitrust violations. You're dividing fields. You have Quaker Oats only doing oatmeal. You have these pharmaceutical companies only doing drugs, and you have a yeast company that is doing fortified yeast. And this is too much control. You're also, so at one point, the 5 pharmaceutical licensees were fighting amongst themselves about how much they were going to charge, and they were actually undercutting each other. And so WARF gets them all in a room and basically says, okay, you're all going to charge the same price. And well, that's price fixing and price controls. And so Thurman Arnold says, you got to stop doing that. And again, I would hasten to add, like, I don't want to defend that process. It was a mistake. At the same time, they were doing it because nobody else was minding the store, and they didn't want this price war battle breaking out between their licensees. But WARF gets it. And so Thurman Arnold makes these demands. And he also says, hey, by the way, you have this clause in your contract that says nobody can sublicense margarine companies. That's also not great. And so WARF basically exceeds almost all of the demands that Thurman Arnold makes. He writes a letter to them, and they change their practices. The problem, though, is that very shortly thereafter, Thurman Arnold is removed from the Department of Justice. He's basically fired by being elevated because what had happened was, well, a war broke out. And Thurman Arnold is famous for being a trust buster, for being anti-corporate, for being anti-big business. And that doesn't really fly. We're in the middle of a war, and FDR needs the companies to collaborate with him. So he appoints Thurman Arnold to the bench to get him out of the Justice Department. And he appoints a guy named Wendell Berge, who is more in line and basically reorganizes the antitrust case so that it's much more about the international fight against fascism. And he comes up with this, he writes a book called Cartels, and this comes out of the testimony he's giving to Congress, in which he says there are these global corporations that are controlling industry, and they're in league with the Nazis, and this is all terrible. And he finds out that WARF had a license with IG Farben, which is a German company, and WARF had signed that in the early 1930s, right? But as with everything in Germany, over the course of the 1930s, it is captured by the Nazis, and so there's this implication that WARF is collaborating with this Nazi regime, and he turns WARF into a scapegoat and basically says WARF is a front for this international vitamin D cartel, which doesn't work with the science. Like WARF did not have a monopoly on vitamin D. You can get vitamin D by going outside and in the sun. There are also other ways of getting vitamin D, cod liver oil, those kind of things. Like WARF never had a monopoly on vitamin D. It had a monopoly on a process for creating vitamin D that it was controlling pretty aggressively. And so the nuance that you had with Thurman Arnold and George Haight, who was the president of WARF, there's a nuanced, I would say, productive relationship there of balancing the interests of a nonprofit corporation with the interests of the government. And when wartime comes along, that gets thrown out the window. And so what ends up happening is the Department of Justice joins a lawsuit that WARF is involved in. It's called Vitamin Technologists is the name of the case, because that's the name of the company that was infringing WARF's patents. And eventually it gets to an appellate court. An appellate court tries to invalidate the Steenbock patents. And that's the one, if you Google around vitamin technologists, you'll see that appellate decision, which is a pretty aggressive decision. It's saying things like margarine is the butter of the poor. And WARF is basically implying that WARF is killing small children and these kinds of things. And therefore the patent should be invalid, and that they were patenting sunshine, which is, again, not accurate. But that's the case that's out there. So what WARF does then is they appeal to the Supreme Court. They're not granted cert. The Supreme Court decides not to hear them. But WARF then sues in another district, another jurisdiction, to try to get two appellate decisions to try to settle this case. And as that's working through the court system, WARF realizes that, well, the Steenbock patents, this is, by now we're getting close to the mid 40s. The Steenbock patents are already starting to expire. And WARF then decides to settle with the Justice Department. And by that time the war ends. This is part of the story that I haven't fully dug into yet, but I think the war ending and just history changing again, the ultimate resolution is a consent decree in which WARF says we will dedicate the patents to the public in exchange for the government dropping all investigations of us and declaring that we did nothing wrong, and we'll just all move on. And so that's the end. And then WARF actually does then continue manufacturing vitamin D additives on our site in Madison for another 20 years or so, making vitamins. But but the patents, they were dedicated to the public in 1946.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And so we're up to the end of World War II. And can you talk a little bit, Kevin, about how that environment after the war then ultimately led to the passage of Bayh-Dole?
And this will probably be part of the story that I think people, certainly in the tech transfer industry, will be more familiar with, because it's part of the story we tell about the Bayh-Dole Act. So at WARF, the patents are dedicated to the public. WARF basically gets into the vitamin manufacturing business. They also have these control laboratories that they've built for the Steenbock process that then become businesses in and of themselves. I mentioned George Keto earlier, who was the head of our insecticide laboratory. So the vitamin control laboratories are expanded into insecticides and pesticides. And so that's what's happening at WARF at that time. But at the same time, in the 1940s, you have an explosion of federal funding of federal agencies. So NIH existed before World War II, but the funding for NIH just explodes in the 40s and 50s. You have the creation of NSF in 1947. I hope I'm getting that date right. But in 1947, and other agencies, so like the Atomic Energy Commission, which is just a massively funded. So unlike World War I, in which the research funding that happened during the war effort is scaled back, you have the competition with the Soviets during the Cold War. It's a different story this time. And so the federal government becomes by far the number one provider of funding for researchers at universities. And it's different than what was happening in the early days of Steenbock and Babcock, when basically the government basically said, we'll give you a certain amount of money and then you can create an experiment station. We're funding the institutions. Or the Land Grant Act, which basically said, we're going to give you land which you can sell off and then use that to create your university. We're not going to tell you what to do in that university. And oh, by the way, we're going to take that land from Native Americans, which is another part of the story. But so up until World War II, the model for government funding is basically, first of all, it's much, much less than what happens later. But it's also institutional funding. We're going to fund an experiment station. We're going to give you money to build your infrastructure, and then you get to decide what the science is. After World War II, it's much more direct grants to direct universities, where you apply for a grant and you're going to do a particular type of research project, and NIH or NSF is going to decide whether they're going to give you money based on that project. So it really turns universities into these places that are independent contractors. And the famous words of Clark Kerr, who is the president of the University of California, he said, universities these days are really a series of independent entrepreneurs united by a common grievance about parking. And that's what universities become really in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, what does it have to do with the Bayh-Dole Act? Well, the policy is that at the time, based on several executive orders, is that if the government is funding the research, then it owns the patent rights and owns the intellectual property rights. And that basically begins to put places like WARF out of business. So I mentioned there's that mini boom that happens in the 30s. A lot of that is just diminishing, and places like Iowa State and WARF continue to exist. But certainly the statistics is it really happens over the course of the 1960s that WARF goes from getting several dozen patent disclosures every year to basically zero by the end of that decade. And so we've had another blockbuster invention by that point. There's a drug called warfarin that was invented in the 40s, and we made a lot of money off of that as well. And that's our second. That's a whole other podcast, I suppose. But after the Steenbock patents and then the warfarin patents, WARF begins to realize, well, I think this business of patenting is probably going to go the way of the dinosaurs, because the federal government is stepping in here. And there's a famous case about an early, for us, about an early chemotherapy drug in which we collaborated with the American Cancer Society and the McArdle Cancer Institute here on the McArdle Cancer Laboratory here on campus. And with Hoffman & Roche, the drug company, developed this early chemotherapy. And we wrote a letter to, we being the director of WARF at the time, wrote a letter to NIH basically saying, are you okay if we try to patent and develop this drug? And they said yes. Then the General Accounting Office gets involved and basically says you shouldn't have done that. And then there's this whole big investigation that, again, a longer story than we may have time to tell. But ultimately, right before the drug is about to go to market, the government steps in and cancels all of WARF's contracts. And so WARF is actually not the patent holder here. It's actually just negotiating on behalf of patents that are owned by the American Cancer Society and Hoffman & Roche. And ultimately, all of the work that WARF put into developing this drug is effectively canceled and we're shut out. And in this case, we were lucky that because of the very kind of backwards way that they did this, the development work actually happened and the drug makes it onto the market. And I think people could look at that story and think, well, the drug came to market. What's the problem? And it's, well, what happened subsequently is that Hoffman & Roche would never work with WARF ever again, because it would be a federally funded research that they're just not going to invest money into. And so that's the problem that's happening there. And so there's a division actually inside WARF. There are people at WARF who are basically saying, we have this investment portfolio, we have these control laboratories, we have all this other business that we're doing. Let's just lean into that. Let's just evolve and become a real estate development organization or a conservation organization. A family had decided to donate a bunch of land in the Wisconsin Dells to WARF. And so we are now property owner. We had all these other things going on. And that was one model, which is we could just go off and find a way to make money that has nothing to do with patents. But there's a couple of people at WARF who see things differently. One is Howard Bremer, who is our patent counsel, and the other was Marv Werpel, who was our director of licensing. And Howard, who I had the privilege of meeting before he passed away in 2013, would tell the story about, he said when he got hired, the people at WARF who are more interested in this business side basically said, we hired you as a patent counsel, but just don't get too comfortable here because your job's not going to exist in a couple of years. And Howard, maybe a little bit of Steenbock in him because he's a little persistent, and he started working with the NIH, with the patent counsels there. Actually, what happened before that was that there's a guy named Hector DeLuca who happened to be Steenbock's very last graduate student and is Steenbock's successor who takes over for Steenbock when Steenbock retires. And DeLuca had never worked with WARF before, but Steenbock had told him the stories. And so one day in the late 1960s, he just walks into the WARF offices and basically says, I'm doing some vitamin D research. I'm wondering if it's patentable. Could you help me? And he finds Howard. And Howard says, well, let's give this a shot. And that's when he starts talking to NIH, and particularly to a guy who works at NIH called Norm Latker, who's a patent counsel there. And Norm Latker knows the statutes well enough to say, well, there's a clause that we have in our contracts that basically allows you to, I can issue you a waiver so that you can try to patent DeLuca's inventions. And that waiver then turns into, they develop over the course of a number of years. They start working with Bill Young, who's the vice chancellor at the university at the time. And they work out an agreement called an institutional patent agreement, which basically says, instead of just this one waiver, we're going to allow everything you did with NIH to be covered by this agreement. So we're just going to sort of assume that everything is waived. And then they have a subsequent agreement then with NSF, and this becomes the IPA program. And this is in the early, starts in 1968, is formalized in 1973. And then, long story short, that IPA agreement becomes the text of what becomes the Bayh-Dole Act. And because then you have Senator Bayh in Indiana, who's having similar conversations with Purdue. They get together with Howard and they figure out the solution, and they introduce the Bayh-Dole Act, which essentially codifies by congressional act what was developed in the Institutional Patent Agreement, and that becomes the Bayh-Dole Act.
Well, Kevin, what are your next steps, and do you think your thesis will ultimately become that book that you were initially hired for?
Well, I don't know. I did just find out literally just yesterday that we may be giving copies of my dissertation to our board of trustees. We're still figuring out if we can get it printed in time, but so that's the first step. And it was I mentioned that my mentor and benefactor Carl Gabranson, former director of WARF, passed away earlier this fall, and I was glad to be able to get a bound version of my dissertation and give it to him before he passed, and write a preface that told the story, which you read, Lisa, which tells the story about how Carl hired me and where that came from. And so that version is available. We have a PDF version online, and if anybody reaches out to me and wants to read it, I'll be happy to share it. I will warn you ahead of time that it's over 500 pages, so just know what you're getting yourself into. But
yeah, having read it, I will say, though, it's a fascinating 500 pages, and it goes pretty quickly.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I would like to maybe polish it up a little here and there, maybe divide it into pieces, try to figure out how, since I deposited and completed my dissertation, I've moved into the policy realm. I guess the way I would describe it, part of it was, as I mentioned, I got hired by the communications department. When Carl was retiring, he went into the office of our director of communications and basically said, "Don't you think WARF needs an historian?" And she said, "Yeah, I do. And I'd like him to be on my team." And so that's how that started. But that's been a really fruitful partnership. And I've really grown more to better understand. What I would say is I'd studied the history, but I didn't really understand what WARF does today. And I understood the biochemistry of 100 years ago. I didn't really, I don't have a science or legal background. And so I'm helping out with things like our non-confidential summaries, what we call our technology summaries, helping out with that process, working with some of our graduate students to try to help that process, and learning a lot about what we do now. I've also been engaged with the Bayh-Dole Coalition and with some of our allies in Washington around patenting to try to better understand those issues and how we can contribute, and try to get in touch with our congressional delegation. So that's kind of been my way of getting up to speed of what's happened over the last 100 years since the history that I was studying. And so that's taking up a lot of my time. And I don't know that I have time right now to really redevelop the dissertation into a book that might get published. But who knows, if this podcast leads to a huge demand, maybe I could convince a publisher to do a little bit more with that. We'll see where that goes.
Well, let's hope that's the case. And Kevin, thank you so much again for spending so much time with me today, talking about the founding of WARF, and for sharing this absolutely fascinating story.
Thanks. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. It's always great to tell the story. I once I get going, I really get going on it. So, but it's always exciting to have a chance to share the story, and I hope it'll generate some other conversations, whether at autumn conferences or just via email. I hope that people will appreciate it, and I also want to hear the stories of the creation of other TTOs. I'd like to hear those stories as well. And so, if people know that story and want to share those with me and try to build a community around some of the scholarship, I think that would be great.
I think that would be fantastic. Thank you so much again, Kevin.
Thank you.
That concludes our deep dive into the history of tech transfer. From the establishment of the first university tech transfer office at WARF to the passing of the Bayh-Dole Act, we've explored the fascinating story of how universities have been able to bring their innovative ideas from the lab to the marketplace. I hope you found this podcast series informative and engaging, and that you've gained a better understanding of the important role that universities play in advancing innovation and driving economic growth. Thank you to our guest, Kevin Walters, and for joining us, and to all of you out there for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.
New to tech transfer or a seasoned pro? Autumn is the global member organization for tech transfer and is here to help you get connected, get smart, and get ahead. Whether you work in academia, research, government, business development, corporate engagement, or startups, Autumn is dedicated to supporting you through education, advocacy, networking, and promotion. Join and you'll receive 20 free live webinars, as well as meaningful discounts on meetings and courses, insider access to a vast network of colleagues to help you through challenges, and align on new technologies and the university decision makers who license them. Membership is open for 2023. Join us.